The Justice Department's Inspector General just handed over a scathing report that found privately operated prisons are drastically more unsafe than public prisons. These so-called contract prisons are largely low-security facilities, typically holding undocumented male immigrants convicted of federal crimes with about 7 years left on their sentence. They hold about 12% of the total federal prison population, and inmates at these 14 contract prisons were found to be 9 times more likely to be placed on lockdown than inmates at any other federal prison. Inmates in private facilities also complained twice as much about medical and dental issues. Joining me now is someone who knows firsthand what the prison system is like. Alex Friedmann is the managing editor of Prison Legal News and associate director of the Human Rights Defense Center. That's a nonprofit that advocates for prisoner rights. Alex, you were locked up for 10 years, but you used that time behind bars to study law. Does this scathing report that found private prisons are more dangerous surprise you at all?
Not at all. In fact, this is just echoing research that goes back to as early as 2001 that has found higher rates of violence at privately operated prisons, including inmate-on-inmate violence as well as inmate-on-staff violence.
Now, these private prisons responded by blaming illegal immigrants on the conditions. Do you agree with that, or do you think it's something else?
Not at all. That's a completely false explanation. Well, first, these are low-security facilities. The Bureau of Prisons, the federal prison system, houses prisoners up to maximum security and still doesn't have problems like those that were detailed in the Office of the Inspector General report. Second, the private prison companies also blame gangs, but there's gangs in federal prisons run by the federal government too. So the explanation is something different than what the private prison companies are saying.
Privately run facilities, quote, incurred more safety and security incidents per capita than comparable Bureau of Prisons institutions. The DOJ's internal watchdog said the Bureau of Prisons needs to improve how it monitors contract prisons in several areas. How do private prisons monitor inmates differently than federal ones?
Well, the issue really is how the Federal Bureau of Prisons monitors its contractors, such as CCA, GEO Group, and MTC, which are operating these facilities holding federal prisoners. That's really the issue. There's a lack of adequate monitoring of what the private contractors are doing. And if the Federal Bureau of Prisons actually held their feet to the fire, made sure they followed the terms of the contract, and cracked down on higher levels of violence, you wouldn't see reports like this. But due to the lack of oversight by the Federal Bureau of Prisons and due to problems within the private prisons that are kind of inherent to the private prison industry, you see things like higher rates of violence, more grievances, higher levels of disciplinary reports, inmates improperly being held in segregation, and the other issues that were identified by the Office of the Inspector General.
Now, Alex, you have some harsh words for private prisons, but you're an investor in GEO and in CCA. Those are some of the nation's oldest and largest for-profit private prison corporations. Why would you invest in something you're battling against?
Well, I'm an activist investor, which means I own a small amount of stock that allows me to attend the company's shareholder meetings each year and to file shareholder resolutions with the company in an effort to try to improve their operations. So it's for that purpose that I'm a shareholder. Also, for full disclosure, I'm a former CCA prisoner. I served 6 years at a CCA-operated prison in Tennessee.
And you served 10 altogether, correct?
Correct.
So going to these meetings, do you feel like you've made a difference? Have you seen any changes since you started going to them?
Well, not really. I mean, these are multi-billion-dollar companies that, reap in hundreds of millions of dollars in profit each year. I'm sure they could care less what a former CCA prisoner has to say when he's attending a CCA shareholders meeting. That being said, people really do need to subject these companies to greater scrutiny. This is one small way that I'm doing so. But on a much larger scale, government contractors need to adequately monitor their contracts to ensure that these companies are doing what the taxpayers are paying them to do. And the Inspector General report indicates that currently that is not the case.
And it makes you wonder, are there different standards? Are they being held to different standards between the private prisons and the public ones?
Well, private prison companies have an inherent need to generate profit, and that's unlike the public prison system. Certainly there are problems in publicly operated prisons. There's no question about that. Prisons are prisons. They're dangerous and harsh places often. But private prison companies have to generate profit. That's the reason they exist. And to do that, they have to cut corners. They have to pay their staff less. They have to understaff. They have to take other methods to ensure they generate profit. And in this type of industry, running prisons, that can be dangerous. That can have serious consequences. And that is one reason why, over the past 6 or 7 years, you've had 4 major riots at privately operated prisons that house federal prisoners.
If they're getting so many criticisms and we're finding so much out about these places, why do they still exist?
Well, that's a great question, because in the real world, if a company is not doing what it's supposed to do, then they would go out of business, or consumers or customers would go elsewhere. But the harsh fact is that our prison officials want the bed space that these companies provide. There's only a limited amount of beds. Historically, the Bureau of Prisons, the federal prison system, has been very overcrowded until just recently, when its population has slightly decreased, although it's still overcrowded. And so in order to use that bed space, they're forced to contract with private companies, even if those companies have higher levels of violence, even if they improperly place prisoners in segregation, even if their employees engage in misconduct, and so on, because they simply have the bed space that federal prison officials need.
So it boils down to convenience.
It boils down to what they believe is necessity. Now, if Congress enacted sentencing reform and other reforms that significantly reduce the federal prison population, then there would not be a need for private prisons to house federal prisoners. But all criminal justice reform legislation has stalled in Congress.
And let's talk about that. Now, Hillary Clinton, she told Black Lives Matter activists that she opposes private prisons, but lobbyists for 2 major prison companies are top fundraisers for the Clinton campaign. And when asked to reform how he'd reform the country's prison system, Donald Trump said, quote, private prisons seems to work a lot better. Libertarian Gary Johnson even contracted with Geo Group to build private prisons in New Mexico when he was the governor there. Do any of these candidates offer any hope in this arena?
Well, and also add that, candidate Bernie Sanders had introduced the Justice is Not for Sale Act that would ban private prisons also. But the fact remains that, there's a lot of political rhetoric, and what people say prior to an election may not be the same as what happens after an election. Regardless, the prison system problems that we have in this country are complex, and there's not a simple or easy way to resolve them. There's a lot of parties that profit enormously from the system as it currently exists. Thus, reform is very difficult. Politicians even, they profit from having present facilities in their jurisdictions that create jobs and economic benefits. You have prison guard unions that benefit from having their membership paying dues into the union. And of course, you have companies like CCA and Geo Group that profit directly from operating correctional facilities. So, the old adage is you follow the money, and there's a lot of money in the private prison industry and a lot of people who are benefiting and profiting from it.
Right. That's true. Alex Friedmann from Legal Prison News, thanks so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you.